Yeah, I was thinking about sharing screen, but all I really be sharing is the Native Land website. I don't have any slides prepared or things like that, so probably just kind of talk and try to leave some room for questions of any kind at the end. Lots of times we get some interesting questions about Native Land website. I don't have any slides prepared or things like that, so sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Kind of talk and try to leave some room for questions of any kind at the end. Okay, hopefully that works. Yeah, community consent and control in mapping. So I'm Victor Temprano. I am the founder of Native Land, which is now an organization, Native Land Digital. And what we do is, if you've used Native Land or seen Native Land before, we map out Indigenous territories, treaties, and languages. Increasingly globally, although focus, especially at the start, on Canada, the US, but now we also do a fair bit in South America, Australia. Australia needs a lot of help, but yeah, New Zealand, and just learning more and more. So with the kind of scale we're working at in terms of the number of nations and the different kinds of places, it's really important that we approach things theoretically from a good place. I mean, that's always important in your projects, but for sure for us, we're dealing with something that's very sensitive, very important, and also very new. So there's not a lot of really well-established ways to go about doing what we're doing. Basically, Native Land, it's just a simple web interface, and you see, this map, and there's tons of polygons on it that are all overlapping. And you can click around, you can search, and figure out, you learn whose traditional territories you're on. It's kind of the idea. And so, there's a lot of data work that goes into that. Ideally, we'd love to be mapping nations or peoples, how they'd like to see themselves represented. That's kind of our goal. We don't have an academic standard in the sense of like, it has to be with this level of source accuracy or this kind of source. We do have some basic research principles we like to. We like to have at least two sources, but we're totally open to that being oral history, or someone telling us an email, or sending us information about their family, or it's a map, a classic map that's like on a website from the nation. We have this really wide variety of sources that we allow. But again, that's not, our goal isn't to be like a legal repository or something like that. We have a disclaimer to that effect that we always show right away. We're trying to do the best we can to represent nations or peoples the way that if someone from that nation was to look at the map, they would feel like, cool, this is right, at least for their own shape or whatever. Now, obviously, there's lots of complex clashing opinions. What are different time periods? Someone from the same nation might think differently from another person from the same nation. Nations that live near each other might have very different ideas of whose territory is where. So these are all things we have to work through, right? Which comes a lot into talking about community consent and control, right? Early on, when I was making the map, we were much more around kind of just doing education. I mean, as a settler myself, I was focused more on, okay, I know settlers don't know this information, and I want to encourage people to start engaging with this kind of stuff. But as we become now Native Land Digital, it's an Indigenous-led, Indigenous-run organization, now it's really much more about mapping Indigenous people on their own terms, and whatever that means, and developing relationships with people around the world. So that leads us into like some of the, just to introduce some of the hard questions that we have to deal with when we're trying to deal with these things like boundaries. We have to ask, like, who has the authority to tell us about a set of boundaries? There's no central authority in any given nation that just tells you, oh, these are the traditional boundaries. Now, that's not to say there never is. In some nations, there is, especially if there's a lot of mapping that has gone on there, or a lot of times if treaty talks are ongoing, you have really good boundary stuff because it's something that, needs to be done for legal purposes. But when we're talking globally, we're talking about really different ideas of like what it even means to be Indigenous. We're not just talking about Canada. Canada has a kind of nation model a lot of the time, but that's not necessarily how it works in some parts of South America or in Africa. A lot of times being Indigenous might be something more like an ethnicity or a language or maybe even a way of dressing. So how do you figure out who is the official source? Well, the answer that I've covered is that you don't. You don't figure out who the official source is. And so you kind of stumble along and try to be as informed as you can and be really open to critique. That's really important. If we want to have at least a defensible position, in the sense that like if someone comes and asks, oh, why is this like this? Why does this shape look like this? We can at least point to something that we did, so it's not just like a random blob. But we know that the sources are not good, and we know the sources are difficult and that they're always shifting. So we really are a kind of crowdsourced map in that way, where people can email us with fixes and corrections all the time, and that leads us to do more and more research. We don't even know how to verify who is from what community. Someone could tell us that they're from a community and this is the truth and that's what it is. And how do we verify? That's a difficult question, right? Especially when we're doing this remotely, or, people don't necessarily have status cards, even in Canada, let alone in the rest of the world. And does a status card mean you're Indigenous or not? No. There's all kinds of definitions, right? So it's really tricky when we're trying to just figure out who do we listen to, who do we talk to. Moreover, the actual nations themselves aren't just static things, even when we're talking about traditional territory. Sometimes this is knowledge that's being rediscovered or actively found. And, elders are telling stories about different places, or different information comes up even in an archaeological record, which can sometimes affect notions of traditional territory. In much of the States, people have been forcibly moved around the country. And so what is traditional territory when we're talking about that? We have to allow it to change over time. So that all comes, when we're talking about, when I'm trying to talk about community consent, there's all these difficulties about like, well, what is a community and what does it mean around the world? And I think one of the important things is that, consent has become this word that I think academics are trying to figure out how to kind of pin it down so that you can get consent, and then the thing you're doing is legitimate. But I think what we all intuitively realize is like consent is an ongoing thing, and it's done by engaging, and it's very hard to figure out. For instance, when we're talking to a community, if we meet a community member who doesn't like what we're doing, does that mean the map should be taken down? And if we meet another person who gives us an idea, should that mean we should put up a map? I think we're really trying to figure out how we go about that, and we don't really know. So one of the important things to us, and something we're doing right now, is really developing this position in the organization, like a staff position, which is just about developing relationships with communities, and not about messaging them and being like, okay, so we need a map shape. What can you tell us about our map shape? But really just learning more about the nation, learning more about the history, whatever they feel is, whatever people feel is valuable to tell us, and we'll take any connection to the community at first, be willing to talk to people. We want to develop a relationship, not for the purpose of native land digital, but because we find that it's really valuable when we interconnect nations, when we interconnect people, and just because we find it really interesting. We love to learn and talk to people around the world. And so I think all of that informs more and more how to even go about this process of giving communities more control. Doesn't mean we should develop like a software platform where communities can log in and verify whether something's true. Again, who gets to log in, and what if you don't have internet access, and what if you don't speak English, and how do we develop it? I think the best way is to just come back to having conversations first. And so that's what we are doing the most. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of investment, but we think it's the most important thing. It's also something that doesn't show results right away, but we feel it's really crucial that that's what we do. So we do have this dedicated like outreach position that we're kind of bringing more and more on board. And we want to keep that organized, so that, again, as people change and nations and our own shapes change, that we can continue to update the information and our own connections as we go along. So I don't really have in this talk like, oh, here's how you're going to get community consent and control in your mapping. It's really like, this is difficult. And we'd love to hear people's ideas about this. Love to hear, other challenges or, just more connections and more things that we could be doing better. And also hope that just this raises, if you're working on your own projects or approaching mapping in your own ways, that it raises some, potential considerations you might have to bring, that things aren't neat, and a lot of times just stumbling ahead, being a little unsure but willing to learn is what I think is the best way to approach this. So I don't know how much time, because we started a little bit late, but I know the next sessions will start in about 8-9 minutes. So I wanted to give some time for questions and stuff. If people have questions, I'm not sure how it works with this. I could just keep talking, but I'd love to open it to questions.
Oh, there is a question right there now, if you want to take one.
This one from Karen.
Yes, exactly.
Considerations of crisis mapping. So yeah, so we don't, it's not something, unfortunately, I can really talk to, since I'm not really doing crisis mapping. Yeah, unfortunately. So sorry, Karen, I can't really, crisis mapping is not something I've really done.
And do you guys find that a lot of, when you try to map out territories, there's no real definitive boundaries, because quite often you'll have one First Nation and another First Nation that have different interpretations of the boundaries. Maybe one follows a certain river and the river moves over time. So it's really hard to map boundaries of that type.
Yeah, definitely there are, one thing people have asked a lot is, oh man, you must get a lot of controversial, like people that, they think that one's wrong. And it actually happens very little that we get one nation messaging us, or people from one nation messaging us about another nation's map being incorrect or wrong. It's actually relatively uncommon. It does happen. People are like, oh, that shape that you have for that other nation is not quite right. And that's difficult to resolve in some cases. Sometimes it is indicative of like larger, conflicts that are way beyond us. We can't bring together different nations and have them kind of reconcile and figure out what the truth is. So in general, we will take that as an indication to do a bit more research and maybe consult a bit more with people from that other nation to make sure they're being represented in a way that makes sense with their own sources, and also to ask them about this relationship. So we try to mainly learn more in that. Since we don't worry about territories being overlapping, like we don't care. That's one of the great things about native land, is that we just put them on there. Each one is done as its own thing. So they don't need to match. So if that river moves and the boundary has kind of shifted and people do some more studies and, oh, the boundary, I guess, went there, that's totally okay with our map. We're happy to show more results rather than less when it comes to having the shape on the map. So.
Interesting. I don't really see any more questions at the moment. Okay. We do have a few more minutes.
Yeah, no, I can just chat some more.
Sure.
So yeah, if anybody has any other questions about mapping Indigenous territories or what we do at Native Land, just a couple, things that are really important for us is in developing those. Again, I talked about it before, but one really important thing is that, and I think it's something good to share. I just see a question there from Shane. I'll just finish my thought first.
Sure.
Is that, again, we don't want to approach this engagement, which is a terrible word, but basically these conversations in an extractive way. We don't want to approach them like, okay, we're coming in there to get the boundary shape, and once we're done, we're done. We really do want to develop like a relationship that's ongoing. And so people, if they need some tech help, or they have some ideas, or they just want to chat, or they're doing language work, and hey, we know this other nation is doing language work, maybe we can connect them. We're really much more in that space, and we think that's much more a true relationship rather than, okay, I get consent so I can do my work. And so I'd encourage others doing work where you're trying to get certain information to really look at it as a relationship, not as a source. So Shane asked me, in BC, a lot of First Nations are working without the province at the table to negotiate boundaries for natural resources. That's pretty interesting. So I guess the idea here is like nations are working with each other to figure out what boundaries would be. It's definitely, it's difficult in light of, you have traditional territory, but then you also have like, okay, what's functional, right? And it's not something that I know a ton about. Oh, let's see, clarify thoughts on how statement intent boundaries are ever changed. So yeah, again, we're not native from native land side. We're not trying to be a legal resource or quite, so we don't really deal too much with how that actually fluctuates with natural resources and for the various purposes. And we really try to, I guess, just assume that the traditional territory map is its own unit, that it's not driven by natural resource stuff. If it is, that's fine with us too, but that's not really how we approach the idea of traditional territory. And yeah, I mean, the statement of intent boundaries would be interchanged because people are learning more about their own history. They're learning more about what their ancestors did and also what's in their scope now, I guess these things are constantly, changing. Karen asks, crowdsourced platforms may be mapping traditional territories. What's their obligation for obtaining community consent? I think that's a really great question. I don't think it's very clear on how we can go about that, on how crowdsourced platforms can do that. I think the most important is that if you start mapping that way, you have to be really clear in disclaimers of just how much you actually have engaged. I think you could have different levels of maps, right? You could have a map like native land, which is really the bottom level, which is like we just get any source we can. We're trying to make a really wide map first. Then we might have some that are like, okay, you have a certain type of source that you need. Maybe you need to have at least had a conversation with 3 elders from the community or something, and that's your source level. And all the way, and you could keep going up, like, oh, we need to have an official thing from the nation. Of course, the issue with these harder source levels is your map is going to be much more sparse. So when it comes to mapping traditional territories, in terms of like what their obligation is, I think if it's going to be something like a base layer in a huge map, so like Google Maps puts it on there, OpenStreetMaps puts it on there, it should have quite a high level of fidelity, so to speak. Like there should be a really strong source for it because there is no room to make a disclaimer, and people will treat it like the truth, like nation, like modern nation boundaries, which are done with like high geographical fidelity. And so it would probably need to be that level, but I don't know how you would do that for the whole world. And I think even harder, just to kind of wrap up, is again, who is Indigenous? What is a community is a really hard question when it comes to mapping traditional territories. We're starting to learn more about mapping in different countries in Africa, and we have to kind of relearn what is Indigenous. So I think it's easy to run ahead with OpenStreetMaps and all that stuff, but I think it should be done more slowly rather than quickly.
Well, you definitely raise some engaging suggestions and ideas, but I think that's all we have time for today.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Victor.